Good morning, YouTube. So I just came back from a trip to Death Valley's Mesquite Flats sand dunes. I wanted to share some images, but I also wanted to kind of talk about some lessons learned. So I spent about 5 days in Death Valley, and what I pretty much did is every morning I spent in Badwater Basin area, and then in the evening I went to the Mesquite Flats sand dunes for late afternoon slash sunset. And I think this was a really great split. More chance of success in the Badwater Basin in the morning time, and then it gave me plenty of time to explore the sand dunes. So if I were to go back, I think I'd probably do the exact same thing. But specific to the sand dunes, I did have a couple of lessons learned. I thought it might be helpful to share. So I'll go into detail throughout the video, but the cliff notes are that there's really three things that I learned. One is that you need to plan ahead. So later in this video, I'll pull up a topographic map and kind of show you. But for the types of shots that I wanted to get, you really want to be facing either directly towards the sun or perpendicular either direction. And I'll go into more detail about how it looks and the reasons why. But if you're trying to shoot sunset specifically, this gets a little bit tricky because you need to plan ahead on where you want to be without walking through your composition and things like that. So that's number one, is definitely plan ahead, know what time you need to be there and when and where you need to be. So the second tip is don't just resort to your wide angle lens. I know landscape photographers, we tend to just bring our wide angle lens as our default. It's what's always on my camera in the bag. The entire time I was in dunes, I did not go to wider than 100 millimeters. So this is my 70 to 200, and this is what was on my camera 90% of the time. And then when I was able to change lenses, I went with the 400 millimeter, which most of the keepers, the shots I really liked, actually came from the 400 millimeter. So if you have a telephoto lens, I would definitely bring it. I think it gives you a much more interesting perspective and gives you the ability to kind of focus on the details you like and kind of cut everything else. So that's the second one. Third one, this one was a hard lesson learned. Photoshop really struggles with any kind of stitching or focus stacking of the dunes. So the sand texture doesn't give Photoshop as much information as, say, a building or a tree that has these defined lines. So I shoot a ton of panos, as you'll see, and Photoshop really struggled to stitch those. I ended up having to use PT GUI, which I hope I'm saying that right, but basically manually stitching, giving control points to tell it where to look. Without that, I wouldn't have been able to stitch. And for focus stacking, I had to manually brush in focus because the software just wasn't able to delineate between the sand in one image versus the sand in the other. So if you're the type of person like me who does a lot of composites with panoramas and photo focus stacking, you're definitely going to want to be careful, not rely too heavily on it, and it's a lot of work in post to make it work. And my final tip is plan to be there before sunrise. If you're going to shoot sunrise and sunset, be there before and long after, because I actually found the blue hour light, and this is true of all dunes. I just got back from White Sands National Park too, and it was true there. The light after the sun has dropped below the horizon and before it comes up, I found to be the most interesting light. The dunes entirely change color, and it's really beautiful. And you get the place to yourself because most people don't get there that early, and they don't stay much longer after the sun sets. But about from when the sun hits the horizon to about 30 to 40 minutes after was actually my favorite time every evening. It was just, the light was fantastic. So hopefully that's helpful. And if you want to get more details, stick around for the next 10 or so minutes and I'll show you some of the images and go through how I planned my trip and how I approached it. And then next week, I'll go through some more specific images about the sandstorm I had and how I shot that and how it all worked. So hope you enjoy. Before heading out for your trip, I would highly recommend pulling up a map like this and doing some planning. So when you're shooting dunes, if you're looking to get those high contrast shots, you're going to want to be facing either directly towards or within, directly towards 90 degrees of the sun. So for sunrise, obviously you'd want to be facing towards the east, and for sunset, you'd want to be facing towards the west. Now, the reason for this is if you think about the sun when it's low on the horizon, it's going to have the same angle of view as you. So if you can't see the shadows the dunes that are in shadow, the sun can't either. So you're not going to get those shadows. And then any light that you see is going to be bouncing back towards you. So it's going to be more of a soft, reflected, diffused light than a direct light if you're facing towards the dune. So in order to get that high contrast, you're going to want to be facing in the general direction of the sun. So it's important to see the dunes layout and get a general idea of where you're going to want to be. I'm going to pull up a quick video right now to demonstrate this. So at this viewpoint right here, we're facing directly away from the sun. So the sun is hitting our back. And you can see that the light is very soft and there are almost no shadows. And again, the reason is because the light that we can see is what's reflecting off of the surface of the sand back to us. and a majority of the light is bouncing away from us. So it's much softer, much lower contrast. As we pan left here, we're going to stop about perpendicular to the sun. And now we can start to see some of those shadows, and we're getting a little bit of contrast. We're still not getting all of the light, but it's definitely a lot more contrast than when we were facing away from the sun. So this is a good option because we're not going to get the sun flare. The sun's not in our frame, but we still get some contrast. As we start to pan left here, you'll see that it gets more and more intense until we finally stop directly facing into the sun. And again, you see that we're getting a ton of contrast. We're getting all that light bouncing towards us and deep shadows, but you do have to fight the sun flare. So that's the only downside. So now that we have a general idea of where you're going to want to be facing for sunrise and sunset, let's just do a quick overview of the actual location. So for shooting sunrise, your best bet is to either park right here in this parking lot or to park just off of 190 on the shoulder. Make sure your car is all the way off the road. And then you're going to want to head out into this area right here. So you have these short, choppy dunes that don't see as much traffic. And then you have a great angle towards the sunrise over here in the northeast. This is very popular for sunrise, so you have to compete with other photographers, and there are not a ton of competitions. So it's definitely good to get here early and make sure that you have your spot set up. For sunset, you have two options. Well, there's plenty of options, but in my opinion, the two best options. First is that you can park in the parking lot, and then you can walk all the way around on this outer edge here. And the reason you want to walk around the outer edge is obviously you don't want to be trampling on your own composition. So until you get out there, you really don't know which dunes you'll be shooting. So it's best to walk along the perimeter so that you know you're not going to trample over your composition. Once you get in about a mile, you'll get to that tallest dune, and from there, the footsteps definitely decrease. Most people don't go past that first dune. It took me about a mile and a half to get to this general area here, which is where I shot most of my images. I really like this section because, as you can see, these are a lot larger, longer sweeping lines versus the short, choppy dunes that you have in the front. So most of the images you see from this set of dunes is taken in this area or this area, and you get tons of intersecting lines, and it's great, but it's also very repetitive. What I liked about this is it was very different. So I'll pull an image on the screen shortly to show you what I shot from here, but you'll see that it's 3 or 4 massive dunes that just have these long sweeping lines, and then it looks like they almost back right up to the mountains. So I really enjoyed this composition here. So this is the first image that I came away with from this back area of the dunes, and as I was mentioning earlier, you can see that the lines are long, continuous shapes rather than the choppy hill-like pattern that you see on the front of the dunes. And I was really drawn to this, and I liked how using a 400 millimeter lens as a pano really compressed the scene, and basically you have this Z shape in the dunes that leads you right to those very dark peaks in the background. So I felt like this was a very balanced composition. I liked how the shrub in the beginning kind of anchors the composition. It's not what you would typically see from the dunes, which is what I was after, was something a little bit different. But just to give you an idea of what you can expect on the back half of the dunes. So this footage shows here about a half-mile north of where we took that previous image. And this white arrow here will show you exactly where I was standing. And you can see where that white arrow is. I was facing basically perpendicular to the sun. And at this point, I wanted to find something facing more towards the sun for sunset. And I really like this composition with this leading line heading towards the dune. There's just tons of texture in the foreground. I wish I had stayed put. Unfortunately, I went about 200 yards further north. I really liked these curves on the right side, and that white arrow now shows where the previous clip was taken. So we haven't gone very far. But overall, I think the previous composition would have been stronger. But while I was standing here, a sandstorm came in out of nowhere. It was almost a wall of sand that just slowly appeared. And within 30 minutes, you could no longer even see those dunes. So the advantage was the sandstorm added a ton of interest and removed the footprints off that tall dune. But the downside was that I didn't have very much time to shoot, and I was pretty much stuck with the composition that I had, and the lens I had for that matter, because I definitely didn't want to change lenses in the sandstorm. So this is the end image I came away with, and I'm happy with it. Again, I don't think the composition is as strong, but I think the wind really saved me on this one, because the wind blowing through the middle really balances it, and the wind coming through the side brings in a ton of interest. So overall, I'm very happy with the image. I think the conditions were outstanding, and I got very lucky. I went with 1/4000th of a second to try and freeze that sand as much as possible. When you have blowing sand, it's not like water to where it looks good blurry. It almost looks like cloud or fog, and it doesn't have very much texture. So you have to be really careful with that blowing sand. Even at 1/4000th of a second, I wish I could have had more texture in that blowing sand because it just looked amazing in person. So this is the final composition, and of the trip, I think this is one of the stronger images just because it's rare to get these types of conditions. So I was very happy and lucky to get this. So I'll likely do a future video specifically shooting in this sandstorm and what I came away with and some tips on how to get images. I apologize for the shakiness, but the winds were relentless. This was only about 10 minutes after I took that previous image, so that gives you an idea of just how fast things can change in Death Valley. So I think it gives you a pretty good idea of what you can expect from this area of the sand dunes, and I think it's definitely worth checking out, especially if you have multiple days. If I only had one shot at sunset, though, this is not the route that I would take. I would actually park down here on 190. Just before this land feature here, you'll see a small parking lot. And it's not marked as a parking lot. It's just basically a gravel area that you could pull over. It is quite a drop from the road, so if you have a low clearance vehicle, I might not recommend it. But once you get into this parking lot, and you'll see signs saying not to drive beyond, this is hard pack here. So it's about 1 mile between the parking area and the dunes, and you'll see tons of footsteps that are dried, and you can follow the footsteps. Once you walk that mile, though, which is an easy mile because it's flat and it's not soft like the sand dunes, this area here is extremely interesting. There's tons of great texture, really great dunes as soon as you get into the dunes, so it's limited effort. The video that I showed earlier showing away from and towards the sun was actually taken right from the beginning of the dunes, just to give you an idea of the compositions that you can expect. So I would say that this area here is great because it's not as well traveled. This whole area has very few footsteps. Mine were the only ones I saw this day, but granted that was right after a sandstorm, so it would have reset the dunes. But from here, if you just go another quarter-mile to a half a mile, you can get to these taller dunes up here, which give you a great vantage point for sunset. So that's what I ended up doing. One thing I did want to point out is if you are going to go this route for sunset, walking back after the sun has set, it's very difficult to find that little parking lot. So I would definitely make sure that you have at least a headlamp, if not a headlamp and GPS to mark your car. You'll see cars driving up and down 190, so the headlights kind of give you an idea of where the road is, but finding your way back to that tiny parking lot can be very difficult. So if you do go this route, make sure you have a headlamp and preferably a GPS as well. I'm going to go ahead and give you a break for my voice and just let you enjoy the view as walking through the dunes from that side parking lot. And this will give you an idea of exactly what you can expect from this area of the park. So these are two of the images that I came away with in the 4 or so hours that I was shooting in the afternoon. It's actually the same dune in the background, just a different angle, different composition, and slightly different light as the evening went on. The image on the left is one of my favorites. I really enjoyed how the shadows and highlights kind of play off each other until you get to that top dune. It's 6 images stitched together for sharpness, one exposure for each dune, essentially. The one on the right is 3 images on the main dune and one on that back dune to give you front to back sharpness. This is a perfect example of what I meant by using a telephoto lens. If we had shot these wide, the perspective would be entirely different. So by compressing the image with a telephoto lens, you keep the perspective of that large dune and everything just seems to fit more cohesively rather than having a wide image where you might have the front dune more commanding and that back dune might be a little more obscured. So that's why I really favor the telephoto lenses in these types of situations. In the entire 5 days that I was in Death Valley, this is the biggest disappointment I had. I set up for sunset on that highest dune on the back end and waited for the sun to set, and I had a beautiful composition set up with a leading line dune in the foreground. Unfortunately, my focus stack missed about a foot or two for that initial dune, and it's just this gap of focus. It's just really distracting, so I had to crop out the entire front. I really liked this composition, though. The dunes were beautiful, and there's this couple walking on that farthest dune, and the woman's wearing a red dress, and I thought it just came together really nicely. So major failure on my part, but overall it is still a beautiful place, and I wanted to show you the composition just to give you an idea of the type of light and composition you can expect from this area of the park. The last thing I wanted to show you is how the sun sets behind the peak and how the color changes so fast. So this is real time, the sun dropping behind the peak, and you see it going from that warm yellow to that nice cool purple blue. And this is when most people start to leave. And I really want to encourage you to stick around, because this first shot I'm showing here is right before the sun drop behind the peaks. And then the next one I'm going to show is about 30 minutes after. And you see you get this nice cool purple blue reflecting off of the dunes. So I would definitely encourage you to stick around for at least 30 minutes past sunset. And if you made it this far, first of all, I want to say thank you. And hopefully we'll see you next week when we review our sandstorm images. And if you like this kind of content, definitely subscribe. We'll be doing a lot of photo reviews and techniques out in the field. And I'll see you next week.